So welcome to the fifth lecture in this series on understanding anger. This is the third of the philosophical perspectives on anger. We did Plato and Aristotle the last 2 months, and now we're looking at one of the other really major schools of the ancient world, the Stoics. They're also what we could call a Socratic school, unlike the Epicureans who we're going to look at next time. And by Socratic school, I mean that they have their origin with Socrates, even though he wasn't, the teacher of Zeno the Stoic. There's all these interesting currents that flow into Stoicism that originally come from Socrates. And he's actually going to be looked at as one of, not the founders, but sort of a hero, a philosophical hero to the Stoics. So these guys are also, like Aristotle did, and Aristotle's school after him, articulating a systematic perspective on anger, along with rationality and emotion. And it's very, very different from the Aristotelian position. As a matter of fact, one thing you can say is the Aristotelians were the Stoics' main target and opponent. So we're going to see something very opposed to Aristotle's position. So what we'll do, as usual, is I'm going to try to get through all of this in about an hour of presentation. We'll do our normal going off on all sorts of digressions. I'll try to keep my own to a minimum, but you guys are welcome to ask about anything at any time. And then we'll have if we have time for it, we'll do like at least a half an hour of just open discussion and question and answer. I don't know if they may kick us out of here at close to the time that we're supposed to end, but we'll try to go as long as we can. So the main topics for this talk, I wanted to give a general overview of Stoicism as a philosophical school, a little bit about their history, and then talk about some of their doctrines, some of their positions that are relevant to this particular topic. And then I wanted to focus in on the Stoic discussions that bear specifically on anger. So the three texts that I picked are all from what we call the Late Stoic period, which is when Stoicism had made its Roman, you might say, infiltration into culture. So one of them is by a guy who's a Roman, Seneca, who could read Greek, but also writes in Latin. Another is by a guy who is a Greek slave who gets taken to Rome, eventually freed, starts teaching in Rome, and then when all the other philosophers are getting kicked out under Domitian, he goes away and winds up back in Greece again, and that's Epictetus. And then we're going to look at this guy who was very influenced by Epictetus and was actually the Roman emperor. One of the very few cases where a high political figure is also a major philosopher. Plato had at one time in the Republic suggested that unless philosophers rule, it's always going to be just, one more crappy regime after another. This was one of the few cases where somebody who actually thought philosophy was a good thing came to power and was able to rule. And he did pretty well in trying to live according to its tenets. So we're going to look at those guys. All of them had something to say about anger. Seneca actually wrote a whole book on anger.
Who was the last one you mentioned?
Marcus Aurelius. So if we look at the Stoics as a school in antiquity, like I said, they can be understood as a Socratic school. Not only was Plato a student of Socrates, there were also these other important figures who started philosophical schools. One of them was this guy Aristot, who started the Cyrenaic school, which is a hedonist school. We'll talk more about them when we get to Epicurus, because they don't really figure into the picture here. Two other schools that were important. One was founded by this guy Antisthenes, and Antisthenes founds the Cynic school. And when we think about cynic, we usually think about a sour person who just has nasty things to say about everybody. And a few of the cynics were like that. But for the most part, you could think of the cynics as being these people obsessed with self-sufficiency, a simple life, and pursuing virtue and knowledge to the expense of everything else. Their symbol was a bag and a staff, because the bag would contain the food for the day, which they would usually get by begging, And the staff, you'd wander around with it. You could also protect yourself with it. And so, Antisthenes is, there's actually a great story where he's talking to Plato, and he's criticizing Plato for having to go to the tyrant's court, and appease the powerful. And Plato says, if you would go to the tyrant's court, you wouldn't be sitting there in the yard washing vegetables like you are. And Antisthenes says, you're right. If I didn't wash vegetables, I'd have to go to the tyrant's court. And the idea is that by being independent, you can avoid these hypocritical entanglements. And so the Cynics were really focused on that. And they're going to be one of the currents that's going to flow into Stoicism. Another school gets founded by Euclides, who founds a school in Megara, so it's called the Megarian school. And they focused a lot on argument, on analyzing argument. They also thought that, good should be understood as something unified. So some of those ideas also flow into the Stoics. And the reason that they do is because this guy Zeno, who founds the Stoic school, he has 3 teachers. One of them is this guy Crates, who's a Cynic. And, Zeno is going to depart from the Cynics on some things, but some of their ideas he's taking over almost wholesale. The notion that virtue is the highest good, it's the thing that really matters the most, everything else should be sacrificed for that if need be. He's getting that from the Cynics, the idea of independence, of living a life where you're not entangled with all sorts of unnecessary things. That's coming from the Cynics. From Stilpo of Megara and possibly Polemo, who at that time was the leader of Plato's old school, the Academy, he gets this emphasis on looking at argument. And the reasons why the Stoics are particularly interested in argument and logic is not for its own sake, but because they think that if we want to live a good life, if we want to have a life that's free, that's untroubled, we actually need to develop our mental capacities so that we can look at our own reasoning processes and start straightening them out. And so that's why they have this heavy emphasis on that. So Zeno, there's a great story. Some people say he was shipwrecked, other people say he managed to discharge his cargo. He was a Phoenician, ethnically from this town of Kidium, and he lands in Athens, and he's in a bookstore. Back then, by the way, books were scrolls, right? So, it's not like Barnes and Nobles where you'd walk in and your browsing meant actually like unrolling these scrolls and looking through them. But they would let you browse, interestingly enough. So he's browsing and he's reading a book by another one of Socrates' students, Xenophon, who most of us know as a historian. But Xenophon had a really strong interest in philosophy himself. And he writes these books called the Memorabilia. Literally just, memories. We call these sort of things memoirs now, or biographies. And he's talking about Socrates. And so Zeno is reading about this. He's like, man, this guy Socrates is very impressive. Is there anybody in Athens like him now? Because he's been dead for quite a while. Is there anybody who does the same sort of thing? And the answer that he gets is, see that guy over there? That's Crates. He's the closest thing you're going to find to Socrates today. So Zeno goes and starts studying with Crates. And he studies with him for 10 years. And Crates does all sorts of, the Cynics were known for being kind of unconventional and liking to, simply put, to screw with people. Diogenes was the guy who, went around with the lantern in the daytime saying, I'm looking for an honest man, can't find any. Crates has Zeno walking across the agora, the marketplace, with a pot full of lentil soup. Now, this is sort of like to humble him, but it's also symbolic of something, because lentils were one of the cheapest things that you could get at the time, and the Cynics ate a lot of lentil soup. It would also tend to give you a bit of flatulence, and so the Cynics thought that doesn't matter. You're really a Cynic if you eat lentil soup. And so, the story is that Zeno is trying to cross, and he's keeping it under his cloak. And so Crates strikes it with his staff and breaks it, and it spills all over him, and Zeno runs away. And so the idea there is that Zeno is a little bit more cautious than these bold cynics. But he does study with him, and he studies with this other guy. And then he starts his own school. He starts teaching, and this is why we call them the Stoics. He starts teaching at the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, in Athens. So, he's teaching outside, basically, in a colonnade, and all these people are coming to listen to him and to take notes, I guess, and think about what he's saying. So at first, these people are called the men of the Stoa. And then they start being called, they're called Zenonians, and then they start getting called men of the Stoa. And he has a number of students. Interestingly, and this tells you a lot about the Stoics, the guy who becomes his successor is not one of the brightest students. Almost all the brightest students end up going bad in one way or another. One of them is actually called Dionysius the Renegade, because he leaves the Stoic school. These other guys, they have their own takes and they depart from the Stoic doctrines on important parts. This guy Cleanthes, who's going to become the second, what we call scholarch, the ruler of the school. He's a boxer, and he starts studying with Zeno, and he does all the menial work. Sometimes he actually works 2 jobs. There's a story told about him that he joked that all these rich people can't seem to support themselves, and yet Cleanthes could support another Cleanthes if he needed to on the little bit of money that he was earning because he was so frugal. Cleanthes, in some ways, he's like Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas got made fun of by his classmates. It looks like he had a weight problem. We don't know what actually caused that, but he also was a pretty big guy. And they thought he was stupid, believe it or not. One of the brightest minds of the Middle Ages at that time they thought was an idiot, and they called him the dumb ox. And his teacher said, down the line, this ox is going to bellow and it will shake all Christendom. There's a famous story about that. And sure enough, Thomas Aquinas became a brilliant thinker. Cleanthes is sort of like that. The other students make fun of him because he's slow. He doesn't catch on. But Zeno says, this guy is not like the rest of you. You're sort of like wax tablets. You write on them very easily. That's what they used a lot instead of chalkboards. But it's easily lost. This guy is like writing on stone. Once he's got it, he's got it. So he's exactly the kind of guy you want in charge of a school. He's not going to deviate from things. And he actually does write quite a few books, believe it or not. The third guy after him, Chrysippus, is sometimes called the second founder of Stoicism. He is a prolific author. Apparently, from what people say, not a very good author. I think when you're writing that much quantity, sometimes the quality goes down. There's a joke about him that said that if you took all the quotations of other people out of his works, there would be almost nothing there. So any of you have ever taught and had students who would just cite things from everywhere, you know exactly what that's like. But he also engaged in debates with the other schools in very important ways. And so he's one of the guys who really puts the Stoic school into contention with all the other schools as a major school, not just some other school, but a major school of antiquity. You could say that there were in the early Hellenistic times, there were 5 main schools. There was Plato's school, the Academy, which eventually went towards skepticism and then came back into some weird mix of things. Aristotle's school, the Lyceum. There was the Stoa. There was the Epicureans' Garden. That was the name of their school, because Epicurus bought a garden and invited all of his friends. And then there were the skeptics. So you have these 5 main currents of philosophy. The Cynics are kind of lesser importance. The Cyrenaics, lesser importance. The Megarians, lesser importance. There's other things that come up, but those are the 5 main ones. Yeah, go ahead.
You said the Plato school, Aristotle school, and what?
Yeah, the Stoics, the Epicureans, and the skeptics. Okay. Some of the skeptics actually took over. Yeah, some of them actually managed to take over Plato's school for a while, the academic skeptics. But there were other skeptics as well. So back to these guys. We get a number of other successors, and you can see these on that chart that I've got for you. Zeno of Tarsus, Diogenes of Babylon, Antipater of Tarsus. And what we've got here is a continuity of teaching going on. This is the early Stoa. Unfortunately, we don't have any of their works. All of them have been lost to antiquity. Chrysippus is supposed to have written over 700 scrolls worth of works, none of which we possess. Maybe if the library at Alexandria, didn't get burned, or other people had kept up stuff, we'd have them, and we may actually find some of them. When we talk about the Epicureans, they have these scrolls that were actually burned, but they're finding ways to decipher what's inside of the burned scrolls. So we could actually luck out and find some trove of ancient Stoic writings, but for right now we don't have that. So
what time period?
Sure.
Those early Greeks are like 300 BC, and then you're talking about Aquinas and the Christian era. So
I was just making a comparison. Aquinas is just an analogy there.
Okay.
He's not connected with the Stoics.
So these guys are just a little after.
These Antipater of Tarsus dies in 130
Okay.
BC. So the early Stoa is going up to the mid 2nd century BC. And then we go into the middle Stoa, and there it starts to get kind of eclectic. These guys, Panaetius of Rhodes, he's the last scholar, by the way. He's the last person established in Athens as the leader of the school. After that, it kind of goes freelance, let's say. People start being Stoics without necessarily being accredited. But Panaetius of Rhodes, he develops this very eclectic position where he starts incorporating some of the ideas from Aristotle's school and from Plato's school into Stoicism. He also, now I failed to mention that some of these other guys towards the end were having connections with Roman culture and Roman emperors. Some of them even travel and start spreading this philosophy throughout the Roman as well as the Greek-speaking world. Panaetius actually becomes a friend of this guy Scipio Africanus, great war hero of Rome, and he travels to Rome where he teaches Stoic philosophy. Then he goes back to Athens. The next guy, Posidonius, he's a really interesting guy. He develops an even more eclectic position, gets into a dispute with other more orthodox Stoics who say this guy isn't really a Stoic at all, but he's probably the most brilliant one of their time. And he establishes a school for philosophy in Rhodes. So now we're seeing other cultural centers springing up where philosophy is becoming a real going concern. And he goes on all these trips because he's got a ton of money. And so he's able to travel. He even travels outside of the Roman Empire. And everywhere he goes, he tells people about this Stoicism idea. And so he's responsible for spreading a lot of Stoic doctrines. A lot of the times what he's spreading is sort of a mix of Stoicism and other stuff. I think a lot of times popularizers work like that. And then we get this kind of it's not the middle Stoa, it's not the late Stoa, it's this middle period in between them where you have Cato the Younger, who's a Roman statesman who becomes a Stoic. He represents Stoicism to the Romans, and he ends up actually killing himself. There are a lot of debates about that sort of stuff. He kills himself rather than live in a world ruled by Caesar, because he thinks that it'll be a world that's radically unfree. Diodotus the Stoic is another figure that we don't know that much about, except that he was Cicero's teacher. And from Cicero, I mentioned that we don't have books of these guys. So we don't have Panaetius or Posidonius' books either. We don't have the Middle Stoa. But because of Cicero, who was himself not a Stoic, we actually know quite a bit about these guys. Because one of the things Cicero would do is he would set up these dialogues where you got, sort of like, an old joke, a Stoic and Epicurean and Aristotelian walk into a bar, But they wouldn't walk into bars, of course. They would be at somebody's villa, or there'd be some other occasion for them to talk. But he would he had actually studied all these philosophies, oftentimes when he was in Greece doing the grand tour back then. but he would put these figures into dialogue with each other. And he wasn't just trying to represent sort of like the average Stoic or the average Aristotle scholar or something like that. He would pick the best. So we know a lot about these other figures because of the quotations that he provides us with. Because he'll have one of his characters say, well, as Panaetius was saying, and he'll go on for paragraph after paragraph of Panaetius. One of his works, On Duties, actually makes reference to Panaetius's work of the same name and incorporates a lot of that text within it. So we're really fortunate. Like I said, Cicero wasn't himself a Stoic. He was rather eclectic. He picked a bit of this and a bit of this and a bit of this. On anger, of course, he takes the Stoic doctrine all the way, as we're going to see. But because of his proclivity for writing about the stuff that he loved, we have records of these guys. Otherwise, we'd, in many respects, be out in the dark. Then we get the Late Stoa. And in the Late Stoa, these are the figures that we actually have books from, fortunately. At least some of them. Seneca the Younger, who is a tutor and then counselor to, very unfortunate for him, Nero, the Emperor Nero, who is responsible for Seneca later on having to kill himself. He writes a lot of letters. He writes a lot of treatises. So he's a great source for Stoicism. We're going to look at his On Anger in just a little bit. This guy Musonius Rufus, who we don't have an awful lot of, unfortunately, he was the teacher of Epictetus. And Epictetus we do actually have quite a bit from, not because Epictetus himself wrote anything down. He thought it wasn't important to do that. But he had a friend and student, Arius, who wrote down 8 scrolls worth of material, 4 of which we still have. So imagine somebody going and after class, sitting down and trying to remember exactly what the professor said. That's what this guy Arius did. If he hadn't done that, we wouldn't know a single thing about this guy Epictetus, because that's where it came from.
No, it's not directly from Epictetus. It's from some student who translated it.
Well, he didn't translate.
No, but okay, I'm leaving. All right.
It's good to
Sadler said this.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to remember too that these guys had much better memories. People in ancient times had much stronger memories than we do today. We weakened our memories by relying so much on written documents, especially the internet.
Probably they didn't have many distractions like we.
They didn't have as many distractions. The distractions that they had were pretty distracting because you're just as drunk back then as you can now. You could lose yourself just as much in sexual proclivities. Oh, what else? You could go to the gladiatorial games or go to the theater like an obsessive, and everything was possible to do that. But the guys who didn't do that, you're right, they had less distractions. There weren't billboards everywhere, Anyway, so the other 2 people that I've got on the chart are Marcus Aurelius, who we're going to talk about, and fortunately he left us his meditations, his sort of like daybook in certain respects, where he's writing things down to himself. It's been very useful for people. And then there's a guy, Heracles the Stoic, and only fragments of his Elements of Ethics have survived. So we don't really know exactly what his position on things were, but he's an interesting guy to mention in that respect. So that's the history of these Stoics. What about what they actually thought?
Question about Cicero.
Yeah.
If he was such an eclectic, wouldn't he have had a lot of followers? Because people aren't always certain in what direction they want to go.
Well, in philosophy, being an eclectic is usually seen as a bad thing. Most often people will try out a whole school and then try out another position. I really like Cicero myself, and his eclecticism is one of the things that attracts me to him, because I see that as you pick the best of this and the best of that, right? But in philosophy, it's often seen as a pejorative term
Make up your mind, huh?
What's that?
Make up your mind.
Yeah.
You're going to this school or that school.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Now, I will say this, though. Cicero's texts managed to survive into the Middle Ages because they're seen as not only such great Latin, so stylistically very good, but also because there's such important thought that's being preserved there. You don't often have Cicero saying, here's my position. He's often saying, here's what they think, here's what they think, here's what they think. When people ask each other, well, can we attack this position or can we defend it? But Cicero is going to have a major effect, as is Seneca too, by the way. Seneca is going to get Christianized, as is Epictetus. There's going to be a Christianized version of Epictetus's Enchiridion floating around out there. The monks are going to be the ones who think Cicero is really great and, copy him out word by word over the centuries. And then he'll have a revival in the 18th century, too. People like David Hume really liking Cicero, actually. Liking him so much that he copies some of the structure of Cicero's dialogues without mentioning that in some of his own dialogues. But yeah, Cicero, the other thing to remember, too, is he was a statesman. And he wound up on the losing side. So, for a lot of people, that meant great guy, but not politically that prudent. So maybe we won't talk that much about what a swell guy he was when the emperor or the emperor's ears are listening. He was a Republican. He wanted to see the Republic saved. He didn't want to see Caesar taking over or anything like that. So, yeah.
Is there a relationship between Buddhism and Cynicism?
Cynicism? I don't think so. You see ascetic movements. So they are similar in that they're ascetic movements. You see ascetic movements like this arising spontaneously in many different cultures. Later on, once the Greeks actually have contact with India, because of Alexander's conquest and because of trade, some Buddhist ideas are going to get looked at as possibly being correlates of Greek ideas, but that's happening much later on.
Developed independently then.
Yeah, and I think it's because there are certain ways of living, certain ways of thinking things out that are bound to occur to somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about things independently of what culture you're in, because once you reach a certain stage of culture, or you might put it another way, a certain stage of things being messy and complicated and screwed up and not having great answers, there's paths of inquiry that you're going to go down, I think. But it is an interesting issue. So let's look at what the Stoics actually taught then. And what I'm going to talk about here is kind of a mishmash of all the different Stoics together. They sometimes disagreed with each other on some of these issues. I already mentioned the strong focus on logic, and I'm not going to talk much more about that, other than to say that the reason they were interested in logic is because the idea was if you get your thoughts clear and your reasoning clear, you're going to get the rest of your life clear. But what they were really interested in was ethics. They were interested in how do you live your life? What is the way to be happy? What is the good life? How should we handle relationships, especially screwed up relationships? Epictetus talks quite a bit about that, which is why he's very useful, I think. And one of their key goals was what they called living in accordance with nature. Now, when they talk about nature, when we hear that, we usually think like somebody going out in the wild and making a log cabin and looking a lot at flowers and plants and birds and stuff like that. They didn't mean that. What their understanding of nature with respect to living in accordance with nature was there's human nature. And what is it to be a human being? It's to be this creature that comes into the world not even close to fully formed and requires an awful lot of cultivation to realize the potential in human nature. The Stoics, they actually thought that we had a bit of God within us, and that bit of the divine is something that we should cultivate. We're also animal, like the other animals, but we're a weird mix. And they thought that most people didn't realize that goal. They also thought of nature in terms of like the whole. And although the Stoics did believe in God or the gods, they didn't believe in a God outside of the universe, sort of transcendent God. They thought of God, some of them thought of God as the entire universe. Some of them thought of God as a kind of rationality pervading the entire universe. Some of them had other, more complicated views on it, so I don't want to take up too much time with that. But the idea was that living in accordance with nature means living in accordance with the totality of nature. Not just like, this would be nature just as much as those trees out there would be nature. So nature is everything that is. They had different views on the human faculties than the other thinkers that we've looked at so far, like Plato and Aristotle. You remember that Plato had these three parts to the soul: the rational part, the emotional or desirous part, and then this weird thing in between where anger happens, the thumatic part, the spirited, passionate part. The Stoics, they pushed that passionate part into the appetitive or emotional part. They disagree with Aristotle in thinking that anger or thumos is a different kind of desire than other desires as well. They're gonna flatten that psychology out a bit. They also see the rational part as inextricably connected with what they call our faculty of choice, in Greek proairesis, this capacity to make oneself what one is, that we're all involved with and responsible for. And like I said, they thought that virtue is the good that we should strive for. They thought that there were four main virtues. This is coming from Plato: justice, temperance, courage, and prudence or practical wisdom. These are what we call the cardinal virtues today, right? And that comes from Plato, but goes through the Stoics. Unlike Aristotle, they thought there's no intermediate between vice or virtue. Either you're vicious or you're virtuous, one or the other. And the Aristotelians would always say, "What about the guy in the middle?" And I said, "Well, there isn't any guy in the middle. You're either one or the other." And
Jekyll
you can.
or Hyde.
What's that?
Jekyll or Hyde.
Well, Hyde wasn't a great guy, He's sort of like Jekyll or Mother Teresa, I suppose would be the. Yeah. But they thought that virtue is what you really ought to be striving for. And unlike Aristotle, they're going to say anger has no connection with virtue whatsoever. There's no such thing as virtuous anger. They also thought that real goods, the only thing that really matters is what lies within our own power to choose, our own power to create habits about, our own power to reason about. Everything else is what they call adiaphora. That means indifferent or doesn't make a difference. So, what color my dossier is doesn't really matter. There could be some preferences there, but in the end, if somebody gives me a pink one, that shouldn't really bother me. It should be okay.
But they say that purple is a centered color.
Well,
It should make a difference.
yeah, for the Stoics, they wouldn't care. Am I dressing up in nice clothes or am I wearing scrubs? Those are indifferent things. What really matters are how I feel about things and how I think about things, what's inside. That I have control over, they think. And they focus a lot on this conception of duty. You can see why this would be very important to the Romans. We have our duties, and they're given to us in part by our relationships and our roles. And it's a question of whether we do them well or don't do them well, but we can't get away from the fact that we actually have them. Now here's where it gets more focused on what we're going to talk about here. The Stoics, for the most part, thought emotions are bad. Some of them did distinguish, as I put on this handout for you, a few positive emotional states. They distinguished three of them: joy, caution, and wishing. And these are all sort of rational, measured emotional states. But they think most people don't have these. All the other emotions are irrational. They're actually against human nature in certain respects. Their excessive impulses or responses to things, they result from incorrect judgments about matters. And we could say, okay, think about what cognitive behavior therapy, which, by the way, has its origin in a guy who took his bearings from Epictetus, this Ellis guy. And he explicitly credits Epictetus with this. If you think about what those sorts of therapy do, they say, when you get angry, what's going on in your head? What are you thinking? Because your thoughts lead to your feelings. Are you making assumptions like that person shouldn't have treated you that way? How do you know that that assumption is correct? And if you can if you can look at these things objectively, which is tough to do when you're angry, so you usually have to do it afterwards. Then you can start to say, oh, maybe I shouldn't be angry in that case. And we could do this with sadness. We could do this with irrational desire for drink or sex or watching TV all day long or whatever. And we might be willing to say, yeah, that sounds pretty good. Bad ideas lead to bad feelings, bad desires. Maybe we should take care of those bad ideas. But the Stoics do that even with love.
Do what?
They do that even with love. Or certain kinds of pleasure. So, they talk, for example, about delight or transport or melting, or even ravishment. Ravishment is when we're like rapt by the music that we're listening to. The Stoics think that that's a bad thing. That's always dangerous. That's liable to get you into trouble. So with respect to anger, what's going on? The uniqueness of anger as thumos that we saw is missing here. Anger is one more emotion like the others, at least until we get to Seneca. If there's going to be any stress on the uniqueness of anger, it's going to be that anger is worse than all the other emotions. For Aristotle, anger was in some ways better, than the other desires. It's better to lose control to temper because that shows a kind of spiritedness and courage rather than lose control to your desire for physical pleasure. Seneca is going to say the exact opposite. Losing control to anger is a temporary madness, he says. Cicero's on duties, actually. Here's one of the places where Cicero isn't eclectic. He takes the Stoic position and he says, Aristotle was wrong for praising anger as a virtuous means. Anger is always to be eradicated. That's how he puts it. Seneca is going to write an entire book on anger. It really should be called Against Anger rather than On Anger, because he's not teaching you how to be angry. He's trying to teach you why you should never be angry.
What about righteous indignation? So what about when Jesus runs those people out of the church?
Yeah, so the Stoics would say that's bad. This is where they're going to be radically different from the Platonists, from the Aristotelians, even some Christian authors. That incident, by the way, we're going to see talked about when we look at the early Christian authors, because they were really conflicted about this too. Because some of them are like, never angry, that's a bad thing. They take a more Stoic position. Some of them are like, well, don't get angry at your brother without cause. But if you got cause, then maybe you need to be angry with him. Yeah.
It seems to me that the Stoics who are against anger and say that's bad completely, are realizing that it can breed revolutions.
Oh, yeah. So we're going to talk about
this is all about control and of a
No.
population.
The Stoics are not interested in control of population. They're interested in control of the self. They, for the most part,
But maybe they came to that because they see that if you lose control of the self, there is also it can create chaos as far as
certainly
as civilization.
But they focus much more on personal relationships than they do on the whole political community. It's only much later that we see Stoics having any sort of positions of power. Like Cato the Elder would be an example of that. But none of these scholarchs had any political power. Yeah.
All the illustrations you provided seem to me to relate to angry behavior. How about feelings of anger which are not necessarily expressed in behavior?
So the Stoics think that those are bad too.
Did they have ways of suppressing feelings of anger?
Oh, we're going to get to that. Yeah,
Okay.
we're moving into now the actual texts that tell us something about this.
Doesn't anger bring out results like what's happening today?
So that would be what the Aristotelians would say. But again, there's a fundamental conflict between the Aristotelian school on anger, which sees anger as sometimes a good thing, sometimes necessary, and the Stoic school, which is going to say always bad. You know, I'm myself not a Stoic. I'm an Aristotelian, so I'm sympathetic to what you're saying. But the Stoics are the strongest and the most coherent opponents of the Aristotelian position, I would say, ever. By the way, not just like at that time, but I think they're the ones who make the strongest arguments that an Aristotelian would have to face ever.
So that's pure Stoics.
Yeah, I mean, most Stoics were pretty pure. You know, I mean, there's so much commitment to be a Stoic that it's not. It's not like you
because you say they're interested in argument to reason out things, right? I feel that way.
Well, right. So you have something in common with the Stoics, but that doesn't make you a Stoic.
No.
To be a Stoic really means a commitment to their ethical doctrines. You know, that's the thing driving the whole project.
Almost like religious.
Yeah, I mean, they are proposing something that is similar to a religion. I'm going to make a digression here and mention something that I came across. There is a school of Stoicism out there that actually has a seminary training people to become, their view of minister is Stoic philosopher. And if you go through their seminary training and become a Stoic philosopher in the United States, because of the way our system works, you can perform marriages. You can do, whatever passes for baptisms among them. I didn't look at it that carefully because I just came across this, and I thought that's pretty interesting, So there has always been a very strong quasi-religious function to Stoicism.
I think the Quakers are very close to some of these principles, at least.
Yeah, one of the big differences between Stoicism and any tradition that's emerging from Christianity would be the issue of love.
Oh, love.
Yeah. Stoics can even say that they value compassion. Although many of them would see pity itself as a bad thing because that's an emotion. But you could have a rational version of that. But Christianity, the Quakers are coming out of a Christian matrix. And there's some who still say we're Christians. There's debate among them about that. But one thing that they clearly do value is love. This self-giving love.
But
So the Stoics don't.
A lot of the Quakers that I've known are very much against music as, the pleasure as a part of the, not contemporary.
You shouldn't give in to
That's
being,
right.
yeah.
That's right. So
Yeah, I mean, you can find similarities. Like Marvin was asking about, asceticism. You can find asceticisms of various sorts that are going to have quite a few elements in common with Stoicism, because if you want to get the mind under control, there's certain things you just can't give into. Like you can't be drinking all the time, you can't be screwing around, you can't be, going around beating people up for no reason. There's some things that are going to have to be like do not cross line, right? And then you're going to strip away other things, and there'll always be like some sort of discourse about, well, why not? Because some follower is going to say, but I like doing this. Why can't I do that, right? And then somebody's going to say, well, look, if you do that sort of thing, you're giving that power over you. And the whole goal of asceticism is to free yourself of those sorts of things. So there's going to be a lot of common elements. So let me go on with Seneca. So Seneca writes a very long book on anger. It's very systematic. And you might even call it an encyclopedia of anger at least the earliest sort of thing like that. And his main target is the Aristotelians. And the reason he's targeting the Aristotelians and other people along those lines is because they're out there in the culture claiming anger can be a good thing. I know sometimes it's bad, but sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's the right thing, sometimes it's, what's appropriate in the situation, sometimes it's rational. They're making all these claims about anger. And he wants to argue that they are wrong on every single one of these cases. He also argues a case for anger being the absolutely worst of all the passions. And that's an interesting kind of thing to explore. Then he also discusses how anger works and its relationship with rationality. That's what's on the handout that I gave you about Seneca. He calls anger a short madness. He's famous for having said that. Now, against the Aristotelian position, the Aristotelians were saying that anger is something in accordance with nature. In certain respects, it's more natural to us human beings than is being total pleasure seekers, addicted to surfing the internet or eating tons of sugar or stuff like that. Anger is kind of like more what we're about, the Aristotelians would say. And the Aristotelians also said anger is something sometimes good.
Yeah.
Right? So we're Aristotelians on that respect. We did Aristotle last time, so now we're going to give the opponents their due. So here's the points that he's going to make. It's sort of like one after the other. The Aristotelians say anger could be controlled by reason, could be harnessed by it. Seneca says, no way. Once you actually let anger grow, it takes over and reason can't resist it. As a matter of fact, reason is going to get swept into its wake and used for rationalizing your behavior. When it is controlled by reason, it's not really anger yet. It's just being a bit kind of irritated. It's not yet anger. Then he says, Aristotle says anger can be used for, rousing the spirit or resisting the evil or punishing the bad, sort of what you're talking about with sometimes, or, you need anger to have a revolution, to change things. And Seneca says, nope, you can do that without anger. The fact that you don't need anger to do that means that you're always taking big risks when you introduce anger. You can do that through reasoning. You can do that through moral virtue. So you don't need anger. As a matter of fact, that's sort of like, now he talks about arms that actually hurt the user. We have all these sci-fi scenarios where we create robots to do our fighting for us and the robots turn on us, like the Terminator movies or the Matrix, all those sorts of things. He sees anger that way. If you're going to let anger in to try to do some of your heavy lifting for you, you're getting ready for anger to run the entire show.
So really, this is an element of Stoicism.
Yeah.
That is wimpish. They're like little pussies.
Well, so that's another thing that he considers, because the Aristotelians say, look, anger is manly. I mean, who gets angriest the most? And they point at two races of people at that time. Look at those Germans. The Germans were pretty uncivilized. Look at those Scythians. The Scythians are the guys who had skulls with drinking cups and stuff like that. And the Scythian women, by the way, fought too. So did a lot of the German women. And there's this definite element of machismo involved with anger, right? And Seneca says that's not real manliness. Real manliness is being able to control yourself. Not like those crazy people.
I almost agree with that too. Somehow, it depends on the situation.
Nonviolence.
Nonviolence. You look at the tremendous control that people had to have
Yeah.
during the civil rights movement,
Yeah, that's
not to
right.
let the dogs get them and the
Yeah.
the fire hoses
Yeah.
and being dragged off to jail. I mean,
Yeah, and if you were to take Aristotle today and you were to show him one of those meetings with the marchers preparing for getting attacked and walking a gauntlet of their own people, trying to provoke them into anger and saying, okay, you lost your temper, you're not going on the march. I think Aristotle probably would be willing to revise his position, because Aristotle says a lot of things that are kind of questionable, where if we had him around today, like Aristotle says, women are deficient men. If I took him in one of my college classrooms, which were mostly women, and said, "What do you think about this? How about you talk with them and see what they're the ones answering the questions." He would have said, "Oh, I guess I was wrong about that." But he was working with his culture at the time, and that culture was a very macho culture. So the Stoics are really countercultural in that respect.
It's usually one extreme to another extreme. There's the middle of the road. We can get somewhere to accept anger as something good, and how
we're going to see that with Marcus Aurelius to a certain extent. But let's go on with Seneca. So another thing the Aristotelian said is we ought to feel anger against bad people. It's a sign of good character to be angry. We talk about righteous indignation. Righteous indignation against bad people doing bad things, that makes sense. And then here's where Seneca says something really witty. He says, so you're going to be mad at everybody, basically, then. Because just about everybody screws up, including you. And he even counts as not being angry at yourself at a certain point. But he says the wise man should be somebody who's fairly free and detached and untroubled. What you're going to do is you're going to make the wise man the angriest guy in the world. He's constantly going to be pissed off because he's just going to look around and see how screwed up things are, and he's going to get angry about it. Is that really what we think the wise man, the philosopher, ought to look like? He's going to be this miserable, constantly sour, irritated person? That doesn't actually make sense. Now, I'm not sure if that's a fair argument to make, but it's a pretty good, witty.
But wouldn't he have to include himself in that category?
Oh,
And so that's going to be unsettling.
One of the things that he does is he says the wise man realizes that he's a screw-up too. And that it doesn't pay to get angry at oneself, because that never actually gets you to do... Yeah, he says, at the end of the day, you should sit down with yourself and have a little chat and review how you're doing and say, how did I do? Oh, I didn't do very well. Well, I'm going to try to do better tomorrow, now that I'm actually paying attention to it. This is a common Stoic practice.
Really?
Yeah.
Self-examination. The examine.
Yeah, the examination of conscience that a lot of Christians incorporated into their spiritual practices was a Stoic practice. By the way, our books that open up like this, that's called a libellum. The Stoics used those early on so they could write down. It was like a handheld book. They'd write down what they did during the day so that they could review it later on. I lost my temper. And Christians adopted that practice so they could keep track of their screw-ups and try to make some progress. But there's a lot in Christianity, in Christian practices, that either bears important similarities or is taken from the Stoics, because they were getting a lot of things done. The other thing that he says against Aristotle is, Aristotle said that anger could be used as an arm for justice. You need it in order to accomplish justice. Seneca says, no, it's an arm that'll turn against you. As a passion, you can't actually rely upon it, because people get angry and then they quit being angry pretty quickly. So if you're going to try to see through, for example, a social movement just based on anger, we do this with elections, and it works great for elections. It works terrible for actually getting anything accomplished politically, because anger isn't enough to see things through. It's enough to get people to show up on election day, but it's not enough to get them to keep on showing up and not just showing up angry at town meetings or when it's time to volunteer. Then you need other things, and Seneca thinks that's going to be rationality.
But when you get very angry,
yeah,
when you're going to make in the elections and so forth, then it drops and you haven't accomplished anything.
Yeah, that's true. Other than getting one bunch of guys out and another bunch of guys in. It's interesting. Go ahead.
You have the swing voters that are I mean, they're angry, but they're right there on the cusp and they're switching back and forth,
Yeah.
Throw that bomb out and 6 weeks later, like, they want to throw the next bomb.
Well, that's because they want somebody else to make the change and not themselves.
That's
People
true.
don't want to make it.
They don't want to be the ones to make
That's
the
right.
effort to make the change, and it has
Yeah.
to begin with the individual.
Yeah, I mean,
You can't take
lasting
politicians.
political change requires local politics. It requires, engagement on a personal level in one's community, and a lot of people would rather just, push a button and do some Facebook likes or, comments or
Let
something like
somebody else
that.
do it.
What's that?
Let somebody else do it.
Yeah, Plato and Rousseau both bring up how do you get the right people involved in politics problem. And the answer that they have works some of the time, which is you point out to them that if they don't get involved, some other schmuck who's going to screw it up, but who's got bad motives, is going to be in charge. And so that's how you get the good people who don't want to do politics to actually do the politics. Sometimes that works. Most of the time, I don't think that
They
carries
don't have
through.
the gifts to cut throats.
There's that too. Yeah, some places are very difficult, like state of Illinois, for example. Anybody who comes from Chicago, it's very difficult to rise without getting dirty. So, without making some deals and getting beholden to somebody, because of the nature of the system. I suspect it's like that in New York City politics, but I don't know enough about it. It's like that all over.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about why anger is the worst. So here's where Seneca gets out the big guns. He says, irascibility does not want to be ruled. There's something fundamentally unlimited about anger. It gets angry with the truth itself if the truth gets in the way. So we can decide whether we want to be people who love the truth or whether we want to be angry, but we can't have both, according to Seneca. Eventually, it can become something even worse than anger. It can turn into this inhuman vice of cruelty, where it's like we're angry all the time, and even though we don't have any reason to be angry with this person over here, we'd like to see them suffer. We'd like to inflict pain upon them. This does happen to people in brutalized conditions. He says that no other passion has a worse appearance. One way that he says you might actually cure somebody who's angry by holding up a mirror to them, but usually by the time that you get them to look into the mirror, they've actually calmed down enough, But if you look at a person who's angry, think about the way anger looks compared to other passions that we experience: joy, surprise, sadness. Anger is more scary. Even it's more scary to look at somebody with an angry face than to look at somebody with a terrified face. It communicates more fear to us.
It's out of control.
Yeah,
Person's out of control.
right. That limitlessness. You can't figure out what they're going to do. Somebody who's angry, who might shout or throw a pan, maybe they'll kill you.
The anger affects them personally, their health and everything.
That's true. He doesn't talk so much about that, but now we know that chronic anger shortens a person's lifespan. It also tends to make people around you want to avoid you, which probably doesn't help either. I bet, right? What else? He says other vices affect our judgment. Anger affects our very sanity. Nobody's exempt from anger, not even the wise person. So that makes it worse than many other vices. He also says, and this goes to the question that some of you were raising, anger is the only vice that can possess an entire state or people. So, one person may be lustful, and they're going to go out and try to, find a partner, or they're going to spend a lot of money on prostitutes, or who knows what else, right? They're going to try to seduce their neighbor's spouse. But it's not like a whole nation can be lustful and try to go out and seduce a whole bunch of spouses. That doesn't happen. But a whole nation can become incensed, angry, hateful towards another.
Well, the only other
group.
thing I could attach to anger like that is greed.
Yeah, so now could greed be, so greed could become sort of like a governing principle within
It's
a nation,
become that.
but can a whole nation become greedy?
Ah.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
an interesting
What about
question.
Germany in World War
Well,
II?
think,
Well, that was less about greed and more about
Power.
wanting to dominate, which you
But-
could say is about anger. You know?
think about how many of us, how much are we willing to give up
Yeah.
to, you know what I'm saying? A lot of us want equal justice, but yet each of us doesn't want to change.
But there we're looking at the individual. We're not looking at the whole
So that's the
nation. Can you say?
Why do they vote in, corporations as a person?
Well, that wasn't voting in it. That was the Supreme Court deciding that one.
But we're still voting for the people who
Yeah.
support it.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we have a whole party that says that was a great decision. We have a whole party that says it was a terrible decision. But we can say that about almost every Supreme Court decision in the last 40 years about the polarization that happens. I mean, we can think about parties as being something like communities as well. Can an entire party be filled with anger?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can an entire party be filled with lust? I don't think so. Or, yeah.
Well, I misheard what you said. I heard it as grief. Like
Oh.
I'm sorry.
And grief is one of the emotions that actually can sweep through a large
You're right.
body.
Sure.
The death of
9/11.
FDR. People
Or
just
9/11,
lined up the
yeah.
rail.
It
Yeah.
took over the nation at 9/11.
But we train our military to be angry, hateful,
Yes.
killing people.
Sort
We
of.
train our young men and women to do that.
I mean, I was
It's
in
the only
there.
way you can deal with an enemy.
Well, you could argue. You could argue.
There's
the
actually
media trains
there's
us
actually
to
a lot of
hate
training
certain
to
bodies
weed
of
that out because you don't want people who are total hotheads. They make bad soldiers. So there is a lot of like aggression, but I'm not sure that it's the same thing as just like raw, rage. Especially when you're dealing with technical stuff. You can't be like super angry and flying a drone, or super angry and operating.
It's not anger.
It's aggression. We train them to be aggressive, to be essentially tools for national policy. But if you're too angry, you can't make it in the military.
No. Well, you can't think when you're angry.
Yeah.
Like
Or-
Rush Limbaugh.
What's that?
Like Rush Limbaugh, you mean?
Well, he wouldn't make. I mean, look at the guy. He wouldn't make it in the military because
No,
he's a big
but he.
dough ball.
No, you were saying that you can't think if you're too angry. I would argue that describes him.
I think he's not angry a lot of the time.
Oh, I think he's filled with
I think
rage.
he's the kind of person who
Violence.
who actually, he's focused on arousing anger in his audience. And, well, money plays into it because if you have a large audience share, then your advertising revenues. But he appeals to an audience that wants to be angry, as does, Chris Matthews. I mean, we can find equally opportunity stuff on the left, too. But he himself couldn't be angry to the degree that he pretends to be angry and be able to do his show well the way he's done for 20 years in order to make that money. So he's appealing to a audience. Glenn Beck, too, is another guy like that. Glenn Beck wants an audience that's angry. The hosts that on the right wing that are like angry all the time don't seem to make it. Like one guy would be an example is Mark Levin. I've never heard him when I'm scanning around the dials without just like pure venom in his voice. And he's not all that successful, I think, in part because you can't make good rhetorical decisions if you're angry all the time. So
Alex Jones is kind of like that. He used to
Right.
hate Bush Cheney. Now he hates Obama. But he just tries his and
he's an equal
he
opportunity
raises
hater
his
then,
voice. He gets all excited.
Yeah.
He hates both sides.
I think someone like Rush Limbaugh illustrates the use of Stoicism to influence other people because he is very rational. He's a good actor. He acts angry in order to make other people angry, but every word is carefully chosen, and other people like that too. it seems to me that Stoicism provides a vehicle to get other people angry while you are just controlling them.
Well, if you were a Stoic, you wouldn't get other people angry.
You wouldn't get other people
No.
angry?
You wouldn't. No.
Oh, that's unethical.
Right.
Right.
Oh, so that...
But
Oh, yeah.
you know, you could certainly apply some of the techniques to
Yeah.
maintain your own control, but you wouldn't be a good Stoic in that case.
All right, so
I suppose you could be a Stoic and get people angry. If you could be a Stoic and watch bulldozers push emaciated bodies from World War II into a ditch and not get angry, then you'd get angry at the Stoic.
Yeah, that could
Can't
be.
you see what's happening here?
Sure, but that's pretty rare, and none of those people were saying, "I am a member of Stoicism." They were usually just shell shocked. You know, there's a difference. There's a difference between Stoicism with like the small s, you know, just like not showing emotion or stuff like that, and Stoic with the big S, actually being a member of this philosophical school.
what are the main ethical principles of the Stoics?
Well, that's what we were talking about earlier. The idea of attaining freedom by living in accordance with nature, figuring out what's within your control and what's not within your control. Prioritizing reason over the passions, those sorts of things. Fulfilling your duties. I mean, a Stoic wouldn't survive the camps
So
because a Stoic would have already resisted the Nazis.
but none of those things really relate directly to relationships among people.
Oh, sure,
society.
duties do. If I'm somebody's son, I have a whole set of duties because of that relationship to them.
It's
Do I have a duty to these other people who are not
Yes,
relatives?
because we're all members of this vast cosmos of nature. The Stoics were the ones who coined the term well, they didn't coin the term. Diogenes, the Cynic, did. But they're the ones who used the term cosmopolitanism, being a citizen of the world. As opposed to most of the ancient peoples who would say, I got my duties to my family, I got my duties to my city, I've got my duties to my country, and then after that, anything goes. Those foreigners, I can do anything I like to them. Stoics would say, no, the person on the other side of the world, I have a relationship with them by the very fact that they are also a human being. They have a little spark of God inside of them, even if they're totally misusing it.
So that limits selfishness.
Yeah, well, selfishness. So that's kind of an interesting thing to bring up, because some people say the Stoics are like the supremely selfish people. They restrict everything just to what they have control over. But the Stoics would say that selfishness in the ordinary sense is something that it's a mistake that comes about because one thinks that external things matter when they really don't. We get selfish about our wealth. We get selfish about our bodies. We should be selfish about our emotions and our perspective, the things that we have control over.
You have duties to yourself.
Say again?
You have a duty to yourself.
But they don't contest that. Yeah.
No.
They think that you should be focused primarily on making the best self that you can be, the most rational, the most virtuous self.
So, therefore, individuality.
Oh yeah.
Therefore, I am the individual, and
Not individualism though.
Individualism. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
They're not for that.
No. I mean.
No, because you have a role. So I'm a young girl, so I have to be somebody's wife, and this is my role. And if I
You could have a
do
whole
what's right,
range
it's
of
right.
roles,
But
in our society. Yeah.
They believed in more or less the cultural. This is your role, the
They-
son's role, the father's role, the
Yeah, but there's
daughter's
a
role.
wide variety of freedom in how you can live out that role.
How about
I mean,
feminism?
Would a Stoic be a feminist? There are Stoic feminists today.
Are they?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is a movement that currently exists today, and there's millions of people who self-identify as Stoics. I'm not one of them, but there's actually a Stoicism week every November, where people have like a class, and there's all sorts of talks about it. Yeah, I mean, you could be a Stoic and a feminist. As culture changes, we sometimes get a better idea about what our duties are. Well, let's go into Epictetus, because some of this is actually addressed by him. So Epictetus says we should strive not to get angry with anyone, because when we get angry, it's because we're mistaken about things. We get mistaken about external things and about appearances, and we forget that the one real good is to have our faculty of choice in accordance with nature. The one thing we really have control over, our character, our interior. And he says that anger, in a certain sense, makes us like just animals. And he's got two different kinds of animals that he says, we shouldn't end up like. The sheep, the herd animals, the herbivores. That's like the people who are into lust and greed and filling their bellies all day. But then there's another kind of animal, the birds of prey, the lions, the vicious, fierce animals, the wolves. We don't want to be like those either. And that's the kind of contentious, angry people. What we're doing is we lose something by doing that, by descending to the purely animal. We fail to realize that we're part of this whole cosmos, that we have a bit of God, a bit of divinity within ourselves, that we're polluting, he says. He has this really great passage, or a couple different passages about what philosophy promises. And he's got a guy who comes to him and says, I understand all the stuff you've been saying about anger, but my brother's angry with me, and I keep explaining this stuff to him, and he won't stop being angry with me. He won't reconcile with me. And Epictetus says, well, it's because it's not your business. How he feels about it, exactly. It's in his control. That's his character. He makes the choices about that.
But his experiences are limited. If you're angry and you're focused on one particular thing,
yeah,
you don't open yourself up to anything else.
That may very well be. The point here is that he's talking about somebody who's complaining about somebody else being angry and saying, look, you don't have any control over that. You don't control whether this other person is angry. They may be angry for terrible reasons, but that's not your business. You don't have control over it. It's not in your power. Bring your brother to me, and we'll see if I can talk to your brother. And if not, you're going to have to learn how to live with it.
But also, as they're saying that if you get, I think she means is that if you're so angry, it doesn't take you anywhere positive, right? But it depends upon how you treat it. Now, I can tell you that when I lived in Brooklyn, there was this young man who was so angry because the traffic was so bad, the horns would blow, this. And what he did one day was he must have thrown something at a car or something. And this guy got real angry. He says, I know where you live. And it frightened him. He said, I lost my cool. So what did he do? He went ahead and he decided to write hankus. Honku, instead of based on haiku. And he went down in my Brooklyn neighborhood, because he bought my house. This is how I know this. And he went and he posted these hankus on the trees.
Wow.
And then he started a web page, and he got people sending hankus from all over the world.
And they put them on the tree?
About traffic and stuff like this. And, I have his book. He sent it to me through the house. But that is a creative way to deal. He got angry.
Sure.
So he realized, okay,
I'm going to still support in his anger.
He wanted to express his anger through poetry. And he expressed it, and he made it big.
That's good if he remained there, but going on the web and getting more people to support his anger.
No, but it basically how he did it was that's how he first planned on doing, and it was releasing. It was creative. It was a way
cathartic,
it was cathartic. And I thought that was just one.
Here, remember, the key thing that Epictetus is talking about is three people. The teacher who's talking about how do you deal with anger, the guy who has dealt with his anger, the brother who is angry at him, and he's telling the guy, look, there's not much you can do about your brother's anger. I'll talk with him if you want me to, but he may not release his anger. People will do counterproductive things. And so what the brother has a choice about is whether he gets angry at his brother for not reconciling. That's what he has control over. And you can point out to somebody what you're doing is stupid, what you're doing is counterproductive, what you're doing, is going to undermine what you want out of things. You can't go into your boss and punch him in the nose. You can't throw rocks at cars. You can tell people all this sort of stuff, but they may still just do what they're going to do because they're motivated by their anger.
That's an important lesson, though, because we're always trying to change somebody.
Yeah.
And what he's saying is, that's not your business. Your business is to change yourself.
Yeah.
Not to try to change other people. That's their business.
And if you want to change yourself,
you can bring it to their focus.
Yeah, you can certainly do that. But that's where your the bringing it to their focus is that's where your business ends. It's the wanting to make them be different than they are.
But doesn't he have a duty toward his brother?
He fulfilled it. His duty towards his brother is to say to his brother, "You shouldn't be angry at me." It's not to make his brother not angry with him. That's Epictetus' point. When other people are angry with us, that's their business. We can like say I'm sorry to them. We can get them a rose and say look how sorry I am. We can write a little note. But if they still want to be angry with us, we've already fulfilled our duty.
Well, that's why we have intervention.
Sometimes,
But it doesn't always work. You can't change a person. They have to change themselves.
So if they don't want to talk to you for the rest of your life, you've lost your brothers.
Yeah.
It lost out on you, really, basically.
Yeah, and part of what Epictetus is getting at here is if you really want to take care of yourself, you have to learn where those limit lines for you lie so that you're not getting entangled with other people's feelings, thoughts that you don't have any control over, and making your own emotional state dependent on theirs.
Well, that's the whole premise of codependency.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and enabling and yeah.
Would that
Now, how does this all fit with, one of the things that has troubled me over the last few years is the amount of judgment that is being layered all over everybody.
Yeah.
And that I don't think is, partly that's business of mine, and it's partly not. A lot of it is not business. Because there's really, either there's anger mixed in or there's a lot of people fixing other people who don't want to be fixed.
So the Stoics think that all emotions involve judgment because you're always judging something to be the case, and that's part of why you have the reaction you do. Epictetus would say, don't worry about other people's judgments. That's not your business. Your judgments are your business. That's where it ends. If you allow other people's wrong-headed judgments or inappropriate judgments to make you angry, you're the one who loses out because of that. And only you have a control over that, he would say. He'd even be willing to say, look, I can't do anything, you have to do it all. It's your faculty of choice that you're working with. Marvin had
the Stoics then tend to require people to be isolated?
No. And they don't actually require anything.
Well, I mean, that seems to be a natural product.
No, you can very easily be involved with all sorts of people without letting their stuff get to you.
Well, but you're also in the position of rejecting some of their feelings, some of their emotional responses.
Rejecting would be still being attached to them. You don't have to do anything with them.
Well, if she gets angry and starts screaming at me, and I simply look the other way and say, you're being foolish, I don't think we'd remain friends very long.
Sure, and there may be some situations where that doesn't work, but that's not the majority of situations. A lot of times when we don't respond in anger to the person who's gotten angry with us, eventually they calm down and start saying things like, "Oh, I was really out of line. I shouldn't have yelled at you." The Stoics are not suggesting. They're not suggesting that you endorse the other person's emotions and take them on and make them your project, and they're not suggesting that you in a moralistic way push them away and reject them. They're just saying you say this doesn't. You say to yourself, this doesn't really concern me.
You don't say it to them.
You can if you want, but that may provoke them.
You say to someone, that's your problem. That's not.
Yeah, you're right.
But then it's kind of like I always think of the barber's, sharpener.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
the
you know,
strap.
to me, when somebody presses my ethics and my way of looking at life,
Yeah.
it sharpens my own view of how I am in the world.
Okay.
And so that it works in a positive way. So I need other people to sharpen me.
Well, they can another person can come along if you want them to and say, I think your anger's out of control.
Mm-hmm.
That's, that's them saying it. That's not them making it their business
No,
in the
that's
sense
exactly
of,
right. But
yeah,
it may also strengthen me in my belief that anger is not a good thing.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying. That strengthens me.
This seems to be limited to individuals or a small group. And you can turn your
Sure.
away from...
Because individuals are what exist.
Yeah, but you cannot do it for a whole nation, or you can't turn away...
Epictetus doesn't say they can. He doesn't care.
You don't-
I mean, it's not your business to try to, change the whole nation.
But maybe it should
No,
be.
but you...
You can change your portion of it, but you're not responsible for the
No,
whole
I know
nation.
you're not responsible, but if we didn't move ahead to get health care and... if we didn't-
Sure.
Yeah.
You're going to find the Stoics actually usually on the progressive side with all these sort of things. So, here's the thing. The Stoics think that individuals are what exist.
Okay.
Communities also exist because there are individuals. If you want to change anything within a community, for the Stoics, you do so as an individual. If you're lucky enough to get placed in a position of power where you can do something, great. If not, that's great too, because you've got enough stuff to work on just with yourself, and the immediate relationships that you have, that you can spend an entire lifetime on it for them. I know if I was a Stoic, I would have enough material just with me and my wife to keep me busy for the next 40 years. Not even worrying about Kingston.
We all,
Yeah.
there is something that a lot of people say that sometimes I just can't agree with. When, all right, if she yells at you
Yeah.
and you say something, you say, well, this isn't my problem. I don't necessarily feel that way. I feel that somewhere, yes, she has a problem, but I'm connected here somehow. And even if it's in a vague way, I want to take it I'm not going to say that I was wrong in something that I felt I wasn't wrong in.
Yeah.
But somehow there's been a connection, and something got this person so angry they screamed at me. Maybe I said something in a way that really I didn't realize was provoking, and wasn't realizing it. And maybe I would learn from that.
That's self-reflection.
Yeah, but the thing is, saying that it isn't necessarily my problem.
I think when
and
people
a lot of people use that a lot.
Yeah.
And sometimes that really turns me
So
off.
the Stoics aren't saying that. I think where people are getting mixed up between sort of contemporary uses of some of these things and what the Stoics mean by this. For the Stoics, what is in our control, what is our business, is our actions, our choices, our thoughts, our emotions, and our desires. So if you want to say to somebody, hey, you're out of line, because they actually are out of line, that's within the realm of your business. How they respond to it and how they feel about it, that's not in there. That's up to them, because that's their business, because they are an individual just as real, just as central to themselves as you are. And if they're screwed up and they arrive at the wrong conclusion, there's not much you can do about it.
No, but what I'm saying, I guess, is am I, what did you say, am I living my virtuous life?
Yeah.
In my eyes, if I ignore it and say that's your problem.
Yeah, I mean, Epictetus
this is the way that, some people say, they say, there's a cartoon, the Republicans are looking, and the guy is drowning.
Oh, I just saw that today. Yeah,
he's a lifeguard,
the boat thing.
And he's going, sorry, you got to pick yourself up by your bootstraps,
Yeah.
or something won't throw in the life preserver.
Yeah, let's go on with Epictetus. There's a few more points I want to make with him. So one of the things that he says is that realizing that other people act according to their point of view, their reasoning, their understanding of basic, preconceptions, their how things appear to them. If we do that, we're going to stop being angry with them. even if they're doing the wrong thing, we don't have to get angry with them. We can respond to them and we can say, hey, you're screwing up, or hey, I'm going to, if we have a position of authority, I'm going to, sanction what you're doing. But we don't have to be angry at the same time as we're doing that. Because the anger only hurts us. It only disturbs other people too, but it really disturbs us. So he says that one of the things you have to do is understand the prices of things. By this he doesn't mean, like sticker prices. He means understanding when we want to have this thing, what comes along with it. So if you want to be invited to the fancy dinner parties, you got to kiss some butt. That's the way it works. So don't get envious of the person who's invited to the fancy dinner party when you didn't go and kiss the host's rear end and say what a swell guy he is, even though he's not. And that's why you're not invited. If you want to get invited, go and do that, because that's how it works. If you're a student and you don't do the homework, and then I'm getting some of these emails at the last minute. You want to say, oh, can you give me a break? I had all these problems. Blah 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 blah. It's always the same old excuses. If you want to get the A, you do the work. If you don't want to do the work, well, then you can't have the A. And so it doesn't pay to get angry about any of these sort of things. What were you saying?
Consequences.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to understand, if you do understand the prices of things, you're going to get a lot less angry. So he talks about, what we nowadays call shrinkage in retail industry, which is things getting stolen or things getting broken, right? That's the cost of doing business. If you're going to let every little thing that people do get to you, you're going to be totally miserable. And the Stoics want to teach us how not to be miserable. He also talks about habit, and he's got some passages here that are particularly good. He says, when you're angry, you can be sure not merely that this evil has befallen you, but that you've strengthened the habit and have, as it were, added fuel to the fire. He says, if you wish not to be hot-tempered, don't feed your habit. Set before it nothing on which it can grow. At the first step, keep quiet and count the days of which you have not been angry. And I've never done this, but he says, if you go as much as 30 days without a fit of anger, sacrifice to God. If you go 30 days, can you imagine not losing your temper for 30 days? I've never done that in my life. You have? That's great.
We have to react. We're alive. We have to react to what is current. We have opinions. We've had experiences. They interact with what's going on in the world.
Either
that doesn't have to
or
make us angry,
their eyes to
Epictetus would
what's
say.
going on. Either that or people, what they do is they close their eyes to what's going on.
Here's what a Stoic would do. A Stoic keeps their eyes open, but they also realize that people in the world are going to act the way that they do because that's the way they see things, and that's their business. So I don't have to let that affect me and my faculty of choice and get it all riled up and angry. I have control over that, Yeah.
I'd like to respond to what you said. Jesus said, be the salt of the earth, be the yeast in the flour.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can change a whole group by just a question you ask. I do this frequently at committee meetings. I don't have to be angry. I just can ask the right question, coming from the right place. Or I can make a statement coming from the right place. And the whole group changes. And people have that power within them.
And you
to
probably,
be the salt of the earth.
Providing the group
you probably can't do that as angry.
Isn't that angry against what you're proposing. They may not have the same philosophy and tolerance of the situation as you do. So they're not going to accept that little intervention that you do.
But my presence is the witness. How I conduct myself is how I present to the world, and that makes a difference.
And again, you don't control how others react to what you put out there. Let me read a few passages by Marcus Aurelius because I promised to talk about him. So he was an emperor. So this guy didn't have to put up with anybody's nonsense.
I have to be downstairs if you don't come in the half hour.
If he wanted to, we'll be done well before half an hour. Yeah. If he'd wanted to execute anyone, he could. I mean, think about this, the sheer temptations that come along with this. He could have like been the worst guy ever. Some of the Roman emperors actually did manage to do that. He's known as one of the last few good emperors. Here's how he suggests that you prepare. He says, begin the morning by saying to yourself, I will meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial. All these things happen to them by reason of their ignorance of what is good and evil. But I who've seen the nature of the good, that it is beautiful, and of the bad, that it is ugly, and the nature of him who does wrong, that it is akin to me, not only of the same blood or seed, but that it participates in the same intelligence and the same portion of the divinity, I can neither be injured by any of them, for no one can fix on me what is ugly, nor can I be angry with my kinsman or hate him. So he suggests this as part of his morning meditation. This is one thing Stoics often do, is a meditation in the morning and meditation in the evening. Start off by being very realistic about the kind of people you're going to run into, including yourself in the mirror, most likely. I'm going to run into the busybody, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceitful. Why are these people this way? Because they've got their basic moral conceptions screwed up, and that's their business. That's not my fault. It's not my responsibility. I don't have to get upset about it. There is a measure of what you call judgment there, but it's very different than being judgmental, isn't it? So he says, here's another one. Are you angry with someone whose armpits stink? Are you angry with him whose mouth smells foul? What good will this anger do you? He's got that kind of mouth. He's got such armpits. It's necessary that such an emanation must come from such thing. But the man has reason, it will be said, and he's able, if he takes pain, to discover wherein he offends. I wish you well of your discovery. Well then, and you have reason, by your rational faculty, stir up his rational faculty. Show him his error, admonish him. If he listens, you're going to cure him, and there is no need of anger. So he's saying, look, you don't need to get angry on the front end, because that's not going to accomplish anything. And talk to the guy, and if he understands, if he says, okay, I'm going to buy some deodorant now, or brush my teeth, then you didn't need to be angry in the first place. It was dumb to get angry. And if he says, well, screw you, I'm just fine, you don't need to get angry about that either, right?
Wear a mask.
That's transferring your anger to him.
Yeah.
Instead of you being angry, you get him angry because
But you have
you're
to
essentially
remember-
rebuking him.
Well, you're telling him that there's something offensive.
Well,
Yeah.
tell it to me, I take it as a rebuke.
Well, that's your choice, though. The Stoics say.
Okay, so you don't have to be angry. You can make me angry instead.
Well, you don't have to be angry. Nobody actually has to be angry.
Well,
It's possible. That's the thing.
easy for you to say.
Yeah.
When my son was 13 and he started to have body odor, he got close to me, so I stepped back a little bit. And he looked at me kind of strange, and I said, I'm going to say something to you out of love. I said, if you want people to stand close to you, you have to bathe and you have to use a deodorant. I said, and only someone who loves you would tell you that.
Yeah.
Because you want to have friends.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so he didn't get angry with me.
Well,
I think the way you say a thing is so very important. It's for your good.
but you weren't angry. You weren't angry and trying to suppress
Well, there
your
was no
anger.
sense of being angry with him for his body odor.
Yeah. It's tough. It's tougher to get people to take you seriously when you're providing them useful feedback. I know this from experience because I often do provide it in a way that sounds angry, and it's almost always rejected. Because I'll be like, "Well, what the hell are you thinking?" Now, if you say that to somebody,
they're going to come out in the fighting mode.
yeah, you're already sort of priming them to be angry at you.
Yeah, but these are these aren't really important things. I mean, and everybody's very different.
Yeah.
I mean, people have certain personalities because they just they're either very passionate.
Yeah.
And I mean, people cry at the tip of they see a sad story and they can't control themselves. We're all different inside.
But he's not
in
just
that
talking
sense,
about body odor or stuff like that. He's talking about anything that we could get angry about.
Injustice. I mean, people are
He says,
angry in Baltimore.
he says, how cruel is it not to allow men to strive after the things which appear to them to be suitable to their nature and profitable, And yet, in a manner, you don't allow them to do this when you're vexed because they do wrong. For they certainly move towards things because they suppose them to be suitable to their nature and profitable to them. But it's not so. Teach them that and show them without being angry. So this can apply to things on the much larger scale. Think about when you have to tell somebody that their alcoholism is ruining their relationships. That's pretty momentous. You can do that without being angry at them, and you're probably going to have a better chance of them choosing on their part to listen to you, which you have no, you don't have any control over whether.
That's what intervention is about.
Yeah.
Intervention.
And how often do interventions actually succeed in the long run? Some of them work, some of them don't. And who's it up to? It's not up to the interveners.
They have to be ready.
Exactly.
Would you talk a little bit, when you're talking about this new school of
Stoicism?
Stoicism, where
Yeah.
they can, you can marry somebody. What does the Stoics do about love, which is an emotion, a passion?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. A lot of them, they often call themselves neo-Stoics, and that part, they're often willing to say, well, I think they're mistaken about that. It's okay to like love somebody, just don't be like, jealous with respect to them or controlling, or you could find ways to work some of this stuff in. But the classic Stoics, they thought that any sort of passion or emotion was going to be a bad thing.
How did they procreate?
Well, they did procreate. You know why they did?
They did.
You know why they did? Because they had a duty to leave behind.
But that's very Hebrew too.
Well, the Hebrew one is a duty that the spouses have to each other, right?
That's right.
And also to God. With the Stoics, it's a duty to the state and to the universe to leave behind human beings. It's not really a duty to your spouse as such. Although I don't know, if we find more Stoic writings down the line, maybe we'll find one who actually said, no, you marry somebody, you're kind of making a commitment that if they want some sex, you'll give it to them, or something like that, right? Or if they want children, you'll procreate with them. And so the Stoics, they did it, but they did it out of duty, which to me seems a little bit, cart before the horse.
Control at one point or another.
You mean their sexuality?
Yes. That does require you to lose control.
Oh, because of the act itself.
The act itself.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. They weren't very romantic people, these Stoics. Well, we're going to talk about the Epicureans next time, so that'll be a good topic for that.
Were they pacifists? It seems they would have had to be.
No.
How do you rationalize that to yourself?
Because you may have a duty to protect your country and your kinsmen and people like that. Marcus Aurelius led campaigns against the Germans.
Violence. It involves violence, which is an emotion, right?
Violence is not an emotion.
Well, how could you possibly... surely a Stoic shouldn't even defend themselves.
Oh no, they
did,
yeah.
And they were
and they would defend their
and doing this absolutely cold, like a machine, so to speak. Yes, I suppose it's duty like sex.
Yeah,
right?
you would do it because reason says that that's the thing to do in those cases.
That
to
seems
resist
fudging
aggression.
it to me, to be honest.
How's it fudging?
Well, I think it because war and is the classic, anger and violence is absolutely at the centre of it, and it's everything that they reject.
I think that for a lot of the people who are involved in war, that can be it. A lot of the other guys, it's fear that they have to master because it's scary to be out there jabbing at guys when they're jabbing at you. But that's not everybody, and the Stoics aren't saying that their doctrine is for everybody. So you don't take the average person as your criterion for things. You take what the Stoic sage is capable of. Hercules was one of their heroes, and they thought that pretty, against all evidence, because the stories that we have about Hercules is he'd get angry and thrash people, but they thought that he was a Stoic sage. that he like did all these labors which involved crushing things or killing things, just passionately. I think there's a lot of what do you call it? Creative reinterpretation going on there. But yeah, they thought that you had a duty to defend your community and yourself. Oh, okay.
Yeah. You just couldn't do it with any enthusiasm.
No, that would be dangerous. So I mean, there would be another case. There'd be another case with the Stoics and the Aristotelians.
Like sex. You could do sex, but you couldn't like it, right?
You're welcome. Thanks.